Okay, everyone. Hello and welcome. My name is Darby and I work at Education First. I will be your moderator for this educational session entitled Unpacking the First Amendment, Using Your Rights. This is the second portion of a two-part series today with our guests from the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C. As your moderator, I will be keeping an eye on the chat, and although I will be off screen, I will still be accessible for the remainder of this session and just kind of standing by. It is my pleasure to introduce you to your facilitators, Jesse, David, and Jean. Welcome, and I will now turn this over to you.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be back to talk about the First Amendment some more. If you were in our first session today, can you let us know in the chat so we know who's returning to join us again? So I sense some people were holding on to questions for us. Now, we talked in our last session about what the First Amendment was, and what rights we have under it. But we now are going to look in this session about how we can use those rights. And to get us started in thinking about it, I brought some examples of how Americans use their First Amendment rights in the past to sort of get the thought going. Now let me share my screen to share. All right, so when we talk about the First Amendment, I want to quickly just go over those 5 freedoms again, in case you weren't in our first session. So we have the freedom of religion, the right to believe what you want or belong to any religion or no religion at all. Speech, the ability to voice your opinion or thoughts using words, symbols, or actions. The freedom of press, the right to publish information without government censorship in newspapers or online sources. We can gather in a group with freedom of assembly, and under petition we can criticize the government and ask for change for policies that impact us, or say, no, we like what's going on, don't change a thing. And this is not a new law. It's been with us for over 200 years. So a lot of Americans have used this freedom over time. And I pulled 5 interesting examples from American history to get us thinking about how people have used their rights in the past and what that means for us today. So I want to start with an example of religion that I think is really interesting. This one dates from 1957, and this is the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom, which was organized with leaders from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, and they led a prayer march on DC. It's not as famous as the later March on Washington, but more than 25,000 participants attended and used many techniques to convey their messages, speeches, songs, prayers, among others. And it's an interesting thing. It's a really, I think, unique way to bring religion into and join the other freedoms. What I want to ask of you is, why do you think the organizers decided to approach this demonstration as a prayer pilgrimage instead of a protest march? Why might be the advantages or disadvantages of that approach? If you have some thoughts, share those in the chat. I think a little bit of a unique space for speech that we're starting to see in very much in a political kind of commentary way is, have you noticed that there are a lot of female politicians wearing white? In fact, just yesterday, Lady Gaga showed up at the Capitol and posted a picture of herself wearing white. What's going on? Well, this color is associated with the suffrage movement, and throughout the past 100+ years, many advocates for women's rights and political goals have worn white for major events. From Vice President Kamala Harris wore white for her acceptance of the election. Back in 2016, we saw candidate Clinton wore a white suit. We saw candidate Shirley Chisholm wore white to announce her presidential bid. So it's an interesting space where we're thinking about people and the endurance of just this color being worn as a way of expressing an idea. We also can go back historically to the press, and this is the story of Elijah Parish Lovejoy. He was an abolitionist publisher of the Alton Observer, and he advocated using his publication, using press, for abolition in the United States. And he actually was killed because of his work. just before his 35th birthday on November 7th, 1837. And he is, in our journalist memorial, one of the first name, of journalists killed on that list. I also want to go a little bit more modern and thinking about how we gather together and what it means when we gather together. So I brought an example of the Pride parades. This one is in New York City, and these are outdoor events, sometimes purely celebrations of LGBTQ+ goals and culture and ideas, but also sometimes they have been political spaces for protests along with gathering. And they're generally held since 1970 on the anniversary of Stonewall riots. Finally, I wanted to bring petition into this with two early examples, because we often think of DC with associations with these protests and big marches, but here are two unique ones from American history. The top picture is of Jacob Coxing, who led a march of unemployed men to the US Capitol in an effort to protest policies at the time. And at the bottom, we see the first picket line ever taking place at the White House, where we see then dubbed the Silent Sentinels. And so when we think about these people, you know, protesting or doing these forms of petition in spaces where they hadn't before, it can inform things that we're so used to seeing. We're used to seeing protests on the National Mall or in front of these places in DC. So as we think about why and how people have used their First Amendment rights in the past, I want us also to consider how can that inform how we use our First Amendment rights today. Now, I'm going to open it up for your questions and discussions during this portion, and I just brought a few examples to get your thoughts going. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I want to start, as people add their questions into the chat, with a question for both of you. Why is it important to know the history of how people have used the First Amendment to help us understand how we can use our rights today? Is it important to know the history of First Amendment expressions? I'm going to start with Jean this time, because I started with David in our last session, and I'd like to hear.
Well, I think it's very important because we can learn from how people have changed the country in the past. You know, we can sort of short circuit the idea of how do we do it by saying, well, how did it happen? You know, young people marched for the abolition of slavery. Young people marched in the movement to give women the right to vote. Young women and men were the power of the modern civil rights movement in many ways. They were the people who, when Dr. Martin Luther King and others, C.T. Vivian and others would organize, students, sometimes high school students, more often college students, but sometimes high school students, and certainly in marches. But when Freedom Riders went, they were largely college students. So, you know, I think one of the concerns I would have if I were starting out was just the question we're trying to answer. How do I do that? Well, look to the past and see what's been successful. You know, the First Amendment gives us the right to raise our voices, to get together with people who think the way we do, and raise our voices to ask government for change. That's free speech, assembly, and petition. And if we see how successful certain things have been in the past, we can use those tactics today. They're no less valid.
Just to add a little bit there, you know, I think unlike other nations in history, the United States wasn't founded on a shared experience or shared background or shared language or culture or anything like that. It was founded on shared values. And our founding fathers understood that the first could be this place where we could find some common ground despite all of this difference of experience and background and thought, that we could come together and say, no matter where you come from and no matter where I come from, both literally and, you know, in our conscience, we common ground and protect our rights for each other. And this country, you know, the First Amendment has been around for over 200 years, and that means there's been over 200 years of a really wide, diverse set of people from just such a variety of backgrounds who have come to the government and said, help us, through court cases, and say, like, let's understand the extent of these rights. And so there's actually this really rich history of lots of different types of people helping define what it means. And so understanding that history is not only really important for you to know your rights at the moment, but it's also really important that you make sure that those rights are here for your kids and for your kids' kids.
Excellent. So I'm going to have to ask the tough questions since we've talked about 200 plus years of First Amendment. Has everyone in American history been allowed to use their First Amendment rights equally, or have we seen limits throughout American history on specific causes or moments? I'll let anyone answer that one.
Yeah. Well, certainly in the area of religion, I think there's been discrimination against minority faiths that are not the biggest faiths in the country. But an interesting twist on that, and David, you can fact check me on this one, but the two biggest or faiths in America today are Baptists collectively and Roman Catholics. If you go back to when the First Amendment was adopted in 1791, they were not the predominant faiths. And because they were allowed to speak and not prevented, they've grown and been able to grow into this dominant position. But there's no question that other faiths have been suppressed. In terms of more general qualities, again, you have to look at the First Amendment ultimately gives a voice to the people who are voiceless in a way in our society. It's a way for something to avoid something that Jefferson and others called the tyranny of the majority. Some group would grow so powerful in our country that it would drown out everybody else or prevent them from speaking. So it's yes, I think at times certain groups have been restrained, but usually what happens is that if their cause is just, if they can convince people, it gives them traction. Even people who were denied the basics of citizenship, African Americans, when there still was slavery, were able in the free states to create something called a shadow Congress, which was a Congress that looked and acted just like the real Congress, if you will. But they were passing legislation against slavery and to deal with issues of equality. So in many ways, I think there have been groups silenced, but they tend to, the power of the First Amendment is to give those groups ultimately a way to reach the nation's conscience. Now, modern day, two groups that I always say are the most restrained in our society: prisoners and students, because there is less constitutional support and support in the courts for those two groups to be able to employ the full degree of rights. I said last session, you never lose them, but they can be restrained. Well, the courts have approved more restraints on students and prisoners than any other groups in our society. So I think we're meeting with one of the two groups today that maybe is more restrained than anybody else, unfortunately. Maybe we could change that by getting together today and you can take up the cause down the road.
David, did you want to add anything?
We sometimes talk about the First Amendment being a shield and not a sword. And there are times where it can serve in both roles. But I think that the First Amendment can be there as it's this nice check against sometimes the kind of rampant opinions of the age that might get in the way of those freedoms, where as long as the First Amendment can have its place in court, usually it's a good shield, and usually it can really be there and protect people who you wouldn't expect it to protect. So in the 1940s, when atheists were barely even understood as part of the large group of kind of Americans, the Supreme Court intentionally said, look, the protection of religion is not just protection of religion, it's protection of non-religion, right? And so it can be there for groups who might not otherwise have the opportunity to have that power, that voice in American society, but that's only because there are enough people who protect it, right? There are enough people who understand it, say in the judiciary system, that can allow that to happen. And if we don't understand our rights and we don't know how we can use those rights, and that goes away, and it becomes easier to infringe upon. Students
have been at the forefront of a number of very important cases in protecting free speech or expanding free speech to be certain that it covers them when school administrators or state governments or others tried to silence them. So in terms of the Pledge of Allegiance, in terms of press rights for students, speech rights for students, students have helped set the law and helped expand and be, David, as you said, that sword rather than the shield, the sword to advance First Amendment rights rather than just a shield for the rights you already have. Students have been very important in that.
So one of the examples I brought with me today of the silent sentinels in front of the White House, I left out of the story that 500 of the 2,000 women approximately who would picket in front of the White House would be arrested for this peaceful protest. And I see someone in the questions has asked, if people have the right to protest, why do we see evidence of law enforcement using methods to distribute the crowd, or why were the silent sentinels arrested for using this First Amendment right? What's the deeper dive on this to help us understand it?
Well, the restraints that we talked about last time, the time, place, and manner, the First Amendment, for example, doesn't protect violent speech or speech that leads to violence or protect violence itself. So we build these guardrails, which is interesting, a term that President Biden used today to talk about freedom, that there were guardrails. But it's a phrase I've been using, David's been using for some time. There are guardrails there because we have to get along. I can't, in my right to protest, let's say, leave the street and go onto your private property. I can't destroy certain things in the name of a cause. We have not unlimited rights, but we do have the rights to carry forward and let our voice be heard.
David, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Peaceful protest is absolutely in the spirit of the First Amendment, right? That is the First Amendment, but protest is not. And the First Amendment doesn't require civility from us, but I think it can inspire that in us, right? It can give us that place to say we disagree, but we need to find some common ground to have a conversation about it. But again, if that's done through violence, it's not protected, and that's also not effective, right? It's not going to actually bring about the change that individual might want to see.
So we're kind of looking at the First Amendment and the not First Amendment portions of this that we're seeing. And I see in the chat someone's asked, when did African Americans gain the ability to openly exercise their First Amendment rights? But I'd like to broaden this question because the law grew over time as people used the First Amendment. When did it start applying to, say, everyone in the United States versus was there an idea it went to citizens first, or did you need voting rights to have it? What's the evolution of that? Gene, I'm going to turn this one to you.
Well, we as Americans, we're a pretty noisy lot. We take into the streets right from even before there was a country. There was something called the Liberty Tree movement, which was usually in a town. You'd pick a tree to protest against the British, and you'd have rallies. Sometimes you'd hang the British governor or mayor in effigy, hopefully, with a dummy, not a real person. Well, when the British cut down the trees, saying, well, we'll stop that, they changed it to the Liberty Stump movement. So they can't stop Americans from getting out there and protesting. So the question is really interesting because it wasn't a case of African Americans or others or Americans in general gaining the right to protest. What very often, unfortunately, is that you have to exercise those rights when people in power don't like what you're saying. So let's just follow up on the African American question. African Americans had the right to protest here. And again, we're protected by the First Amendment, even though they weren't citizens. The First Amendment protects anybody. If you're a visitor from Great Britain and you come into the United States, you have free speech rights under our First Amendment. It doesn't require you to be a citizen. But what happened with African Americans, again, is, frankly, in my view, even if a law was passed to limit the right of African Americans to speak, that was an immoral and illegal law. So they never really had to gain back their rights. What they had to do, to the great tragedy of our country, was to insist that those rights be honored and obeyed, that they be allowed to carry out their rights. So again, what we saw many times in my lifetime as a young man, maybe the age of the students who were with us today, was police officials in the North and the South, often using really awful, brutal tactics to silence people who had every right to speak, but were saying things that those people in power didn't want to hear.
I think that's really important what you said there, Gene, is that there's a difference between having a right and then having the ability to exercise that right, right? I mentioned this before, but if you want your rights to be protected, you have to fight for those same rights for other people, even when you disagree. And the sad truth in this country is that for a long time, and in many different contexts, there hasn't been a fight for the same kind of process or justice applied to African Americans as there has been to whites. And there are obviously moments like, the 14th Amendment after the Civil War in the 1800s, and ideas of like equal protection under law and due process, do a lot to expand that. But those are always fighting against kind of, the culture or the other kind of systemic aspects that might be involved. And so it's up to us then to take that responsibility and say, okay, well, if I want my right protected, then I have to do that for other people and people who look and think and act differently than I do too.
In 1964, in 1965, we got the Voting Rights Acts, and they were designed to prevent officials who did not wish African Americans to exercise their right to vote. And we look at voting as the ultimate expression of petition. That's the ultimate way you get government to change, even though it's not specifically a First Amendment freedom. But they were silly tests that they set up when an African American person would go into a county courthouse, generally in the South. They might be asked a question in order to qualify to vote. How many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? It's a classic question. Well, nobody could. It's an impossible question to answer. But of course, no matter what you said, you didn't answer it. They said, "Oh, sorry, you can't be qualified to vote." And so we've had to fight as a society to remove those hurdles. It wasn't as if African Americans or other people in our country didn't have the right to vote. Some people were trying to take that away from them. And that's often been what we've seen in American history. The rights are there. David, as you said, it's the ability to exercise them where the fight has come.
So we're talking a little bit about using the First Amendment. I see a question in the chat that says, when did the events of 2 weeks ago change from being protected by the First Amendment to something that's not protected by the First Amendment? And even I brought an example of something that was inspired by non-First Amendment protected events. The Pride parades and came out of commemorating the Stonewall riot, which is not First Amendment protected. So how do we think about the First Amendment protections and the not First Amendment protections as we're using our rights?
Generally, if you look at the events of 2 weeks ago at the Capitol, those people who marched were probably pretty well protected. They may have committed some trespass or something on the way marching from the rally at the White House area up to the Capitol building, but they were probably pretty well protected by the First Amendment. They were protected by the First Amendment even when they said hateful things, and when they shouted, and when they insulted police, and they used obscenities. They were not protected the moment they tried to break into that building. And they certainly were never protected for what went on inside the building because they were already committing a crime of trespass. A very quick example is I could say something very hateful about a group of people. I could even say things like, I wish that they would go, or I wish that terrible things would happen to them. I'm probably protected. I might say something that in 2 weeks, somebody says, oh, that's why I did it. 2 weeks has passed, I'm still protected. But if I say something hateful and say, I wish they would be beaten up, and then I go, and there's one now, that is not protected speech. I have moved from the idea to conduct, and that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Real quickly, and there's also a difference, those protesters using their First Amendment, right to protest and to speech, the government can't punish them, when they were doing that lawfully. But that doesn't mean that depending on the private organization, say that person works for, again, we talked about this a little bit last time, the same rules are not applicable at all times in a private organization or in a private context. And so, if an employee is let go, as long as that, again, falls within certain other kind of legal parameters inside employment law, then that's their speech isn't being inhibited by the private. The private company doesn't have to worry about inhibiting their speech, I guess, in this way.
Right. The First Amendment only applies to government, whether that's federal, state, local, school officials, teachers. They're all seen as government. But if you work for a ice cream cone manufacturer or something, they're not bound by the First Amendment.
So, David, I'd like to ask a question for you, because I brought an example where people use religion to advocate for a cause, and people might, based on their religious beliefs, advocate for something that I am for or against based on my beliefs. How do we balance those two things as we use our First Amendment?
Yeah, so that's it's totally okay. Say, if you have one group, protesting pro-choice and one group protesting pro-life, right? And both are trying each other, and there will be religious people in both of those groups, right? That fall on different sides of that issue. And the debate there is important, right? Like, that's one of the special things about this country, is that we allow these kinds of conversations to be had out in the open, and ways in which lots of people can join the public square and participate in them. And that's good, right? When you start to limit that ability to have those discussions or have these kinds of tough conversations, that's when we start to look like some maybe dictatorial countries that have existed now and in the past, and so that's the question that we always have to ask ourselves is when I see someone using their First Amendment rights to do something that I don't like, if I want to take action against it, I have to recognize that action has the real likelihood of limiting my own rights too. And so that's this balance between I think most of us here would agree that having this wide access to these rights is really the best case scenario, and starting to limit them in those ways just because we don't like what people are saying or just because we disagree with them, 10, 15 years from now, you could be on the other side, and you wouldn't appreciate that very much at all. So I think that's really helpful to keep in mind.
So we talked a lot in the last session about sort of the responsibility of using our rights. And I see a question in the comments about conspiracy theories or fake news or QAnon or things about COVID. Are those protected as well? And we've talked a lot about speech and press and things like that, but I don't remember anywhere where we said we were obliged to tell the truth. Is that true?
It's not only is it true, there's actually a Supreme Court decision that said it's okay to lie. Now, they didn't say morally it's okay, but under the law, it had to do with a man who claimed to have a certain military medal that he didn't. And unless that was used to, say, extort money or get money out of somebody to commit fraud, just telling that story was not was protected by the First Amendment. I think because it's when you get into truth, sometimes there's a degree of truth in something, and it's also might be not quite as true to others. And also sometimes people just don't think that's the right way to do something. I say something and you say something else. But I always felt that the First Amendment, the way the founders designed it to operate, to talk to each other, was designed to get us to the best possible solution for the greatest number of people in the shortest amount of time, to help out each other. And so I always say, it's my own idea, maybe, and the founders as well, you have the right to say anything you want, but to me, you ought to have something worth saying when you speak. Now, you can make a joke or something that's incidental, but if you're talking about a serious topic, now, one of the reasons our education efforts, Jesse, which you lead, exist is to help us deal with misinformation and disinformation. I think a much more First Amendment friendly way to do this is to learn to spot mis and disinformation rather than trying to silence it.
I have to agree, and it really does come into this theme that somehow emerged in our two sessions, that the First Amendment just says, yes, here are your rights. What we choose to do with them shapes what the First Amendment does, the causes we advocate for, the conversations we have. So if fake news bothers us or these things bother us, we have within us the capacity, the constitutionally ensured capacity, to put our thoughts and change out into the world. Now, I want to be courteous of time, and David and Jean, thank you so much for having this conversation with me and with everyone who joined. If you're interested in diving into the First Amendment more, please check out freedomforum.org. And you also can find information at our educational website, museumed.org, with resources on exploring and understanding your First Amendment rights. They're available in our expo booth, so please check it out. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. And thank you, Darby, for having us.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. What a great conversation. A huge thank you to Jesse, David, and Jean from the Freedom Forum, and all of you at home and in classrooms around the country for joining the session and for your engagement. That was awesome. At this time, please head back to the main stage. We'll have a short break, and then we will have our closing ceremonies for the day, and that you certainly do not want to miss. So we will see you again shortly. Team, thank you again. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
everyone.
See everyone soon. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.